The noise inside the exhibition hall was the kind that pressed against your chest space from the sound system, the sharp crack of pads being hit somewhere backstage, the overlapping conversations of 300 people who had paid good money to watch other people get hurt. Las Vegas had a way of turning almost anything into a spectacle, and the Regional Martial Arts Showcase at the Pinnacle Convention Center was no different. Banners hung from the rafters. Vended me sold protein bars and branded hoodies near the entrance. Somewhere near the back, a man in a pressed white G was signing autographs, while two cameras tracked his every movement. The air smelled like chalk dust and energy drinks, and the lights overhead were the particular shade of white that made everyone look slightly too pale or slightly too sharp, depending on how much they had to hide. It was the kind of room that rewarded loudness, the kind of room that decided, within the first few seconds of looking at you, exactly what you were worth. Monica Grant walked in at 8:47 in the evening, wearing a faded navy hoodie, dark jeans, and a pair of worn training shoes that had seen more actual use than anything on display in the vendor section. She paid at the door. She did not give her name. She found a spot near the right side of the main exhibition mat and stood there with her arms loosely crossed, watching the warm-up demonstrations with the quiet, unhurried attention of someone who had nothing to prove and no particular interest in proving it. She was in her early 40s, her hair pulled back with a plain elastic band, her face carrying that particular stillness that is not the same thing as calm. It is something deeper, something that comes from having been in situations where agitation would cost you your life. She had a small scar along the outer edge of her left forearm and a larger one, barely visible beneath her sleeve, that ran from elbow to wrist on her right. She had never talked about either of them in polite company. She did not talk about much of anything in polite company, which was part of why she had very few people she could call close friends, and why that fact did not particularly bother her. Several people near the mat noticed her, simply because she was there a woman alone, dressed for neither competition nor performance, standing with the ease of someone who had already assessed every exit in the room without appearing to look for them. A cluster of young male fighters near the warm-up area glanced over. One of them, a heavy-set kid with taped wrists and the easy confidence of someone who had never genuinely lost, leaned toward his training partner. "You think she's in the right place?" The other one laughed. "Fitness influencer, maybe. Or one of those people who takes a Saturday kickboxing class and thinks that counts." They weren't being cruel the way cruel people are. They were being thoughtless, the way comfortable people are, which is a different thing, and in some ways worse, because it requires no malice at all. It requires only the assumption that they already know the shape of the world and where everyone in it belongs. The man who had been signing autographs near the back was named Derek Calloway. He had built something in the years since leaving the United States Marine Corps, not a mission, not a purpose, but a brand. He had a training channel with a following well into the seven figures, a line of merchandise, a second-degree black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and a subcategory of content that had made him particularly popular: the challenge video. He would identify someone at an event, usually someone who looked out of place, usually someone who had expressed a willingness to try, and he would invite them onto the mat in front of a crowd and in front of his camera crew, and the footage that followed had a way of being very good for his numbers, regardless of how it ended, though it generally ended the same way. He was skilled. That was the honest truth of it, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. He was fast and technically proficient, and he understood leverage and timing in the way that only serious training produces. He also understood humiliation, as a tool understood that there was an audience for watching someone be diminished, and that the audience was large, and that feeding it consistently was how you kept your numbers climbing. He was not the worst man in that room. He was simply a man who had decided that other people's embarrassment was a resource, and that decision had become so normal to him, he no longer experienced it as a decision at all. Standing against the wall near one of the support columns, a man in his late 50s watched Monica Grant the way a person watches something they recognize from a long time ago. His name was Raymond Holt, and he had spent 22 years in the United States Army, the last 11 of them working in training and evaluation for special operations units. He had a bad knee, a slight tremor in his left hand from an injury that had never fully healed, and the posture of a man who had spent decades being the most prepared person in any given space. He had seen Monica Grant in a training facility at Fort Bragg a long time ago. He had been on the evaluation team. He had watched her do things that he still thought about when he was trying to explain to people what the difference was between someone who had been taught to fight and someone who had been trained to end violence as quickly as possible. He had tried to tell two other people about her in the years since. Neither of them had believed him without seeing it, and he understood why. She was not large. She did not carry herself like someone waiting to demonstrate something. She simply occupied space, the way very still water occupies a container completely, quietly, and with a depth that was not visible from the surface. Raymond watched her from across the room and felt something he had not felt in a long time, which was the low hum of genuine concern on behalf of whoever was going to step onto that mat with her, assuming it came to that. He started moving toward the edge of the crowd near the demonstration area. He was not quite sure what he intended to do, only that he felt the need to be closer. Derek Calloway's demonstration was exactly what the crowd had come to see. He moved with the fluid aggression of someone who had trained his body to be an argument to make the case, through motion, that he was the most dangerous thing in the room. His sparring partner for the demonstration was a willing student, a young man from his own training facility, who absorbed 3 sharp throws and a controlled ground submission, with the good-natured cooperation of someone who understood that his job was to make Derek look excellent. The crowd responded the way crowds respond to that kind of controlled dominance with noise, with phone cameras raising like a slow tide, with the particular energy of people who have been given permission to be excited. Derek stood at the center of the mat and breathed easily, the way you breathe when effort costs you nothing. And he smiled the smile of a man who was exactly where he had designed himself to be. "Who wants to try?" he said. And the words were casual, almost generous, the way a lion is generous when it is not particularly hungry. His camera operator moved along the edge of the mat. Several people in the crowd laughed and pointed toward friends who shook their heads. Then someone near the front, a young man who probably thought he was being supportive, pointed toward Monica. Several other people picked it up immediately, the way a crowd finds a current and follows it. "Her. Let her up." The laughter that followed was not malicious exactly, but it was not kind either. It was the laughter of people who had decided, in under 3 seconds, what the next 60 seconds would look like, and were already enjoying it in advance. Derek turned to look at Monica. He let the look run slowly from her feet to her face, the kind of measured assessment that was designed to be noticed, designed to feel like a verdict. Then he grinned. "Come on up. I'll take it easy." He held out a hand in the direction of the mat with the practiced magnanimity of someone who believed he was being generous. The camera was on him. The lights were on him. Everything in the room was on him. Monica did not move immediately. She looked at him the way you look at something you have already categorized. Then she said, quietly but clearly enough that the people nearest her could hear it, "Are you sure you want to do this in front of a camera?" The question was not a threat. It was not even a challenge. It was something closer to a sincere inquiry, the kind of thing you say when you want to give someone the opportunity to reconsider before the information becomes permanent. Derek laughed. He heard it as a bluff. He heard it as fear dressed up in a question. He waved her forward. "Absolutely." The MC materialized beside her with a microphone, the way MCs at these events always do, full of performative energy, reading the crowd. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Monica looked at him with the particular patience of a woman who had been called sweetheart by men who thought it was a compliment for 4 decades. "Monica Grant," she said. Somewhere behind her, toward the back of the room, a ceramic water bottle slipped from a hand and hit the concrete floor with a sound like a small explosion. Raymond Holt had heard the name. He started moving faster. Raymond had been at Fort Bragg when Monica Grant walked into a training facility and spent 11 days doing things that changed the way the evaluation team thought about close-quarters combat doctrine. He had been in the room on the 4th day when a 230-pound SEAL candidate, a man who had spent 3 years training, specifically for the selection process, ended up on the floor in 4 seconds, not injured, not embarrassed, simply stopped, the way a clock is stopped when someone removes a small, essential part. Monica had not appeared to hurry. She had not appeared to use unusual force. She had simply moved in a particular way that removed options from the situation until there was only one option left, and that option was the floor. The candidate had stood up and looked at her with an expression that Raymond had spent years trying to describe accurately. It was not quite respect, and it was not quite awe. It was the expression of a man who had just been shown a version of the world that he had not known existed. The other candidates had gone very quiet. The instructors had gone very quiet. Monica Grant had handed the man his water bottle and walked to the other side of the mat and stood there, still and ready, waiting for whoever was next. They called her the ghost instructor, not because she was quiet though she was, but because she had a way of being present in a situation as something that could not quite be located until it was already deciding the outcome. She did not announce herself. She did not perform. She operated at a level of efficiency that looked, to the untrained eye, like it could not possibly be what it was. Her methodology was built on a simple principle that she had explained exactly once in a briefing that Raymond had transcribed and kept for years afterward. The fastest way to end a fight is to remove the other person's ability to make decisions, not to hurt them, not to overpower them, to put them in a place where the only choice available to them is to stop. Everything else, the locks, the takedowns, the pressure points, the footwork, was in service of that principle. She had trained with Israeli military instructors and with a retired Japanese judoka who had competed in 3 Olympic Games. She had been brought in for 2 separate international special operations training programs, once in Europe and once in a location that was not discussed in any document she had ever signed. She had spent 15 years doing a job that made most people's understanding of martial arts look like a diagram of swimming drawn by someone who had never seen water. She had also spent 15 years being asked, at the beginning of every new assignment, whether she was sure she was in the right place, whether there had been some confusion, whether she might be more comfortable in an administrative role. She had answered the question differently at different points in her career. At the beginning, she had answered it with her credentials. In the middle, she had answered it with her performance record. Near the end, she had stopped answering it at all, because she had realized that the question was not really a question. It was a door that kept appearing in front of her, and no matter how many times she walked through it, there was always another one on the other side. She had left the service 3 years ago, not because the work had broken her, but because the bureaucracy of being doubted had become a heavier thing to carry than anything the work itself had asked of her. She was at the showcase that night because a former colleague had asked her to evaluate a young athlete he was considering for a training program. She had watched the athlete's 2 preliminary bouts. She had made her assessment. She had been about to leave when the crowd had carried her name toward the mat. Raymond pushed through the last layer of spectators. He could see the back of Monica's head. He could see Derek Calloway on the mat, loosening his shoulders, smiling for the camera. "Don't put her up there," Raymond said to the man standing next to him, who looked at him with the expression of someone hearing a foreign language. Raymond said it again, louder. The bass from the sound system absorbed the words. The MC was already narrating. The crowd was already alive with the particular electricity of anticipated comedy. Monica stepped onto the mat. The camera crew repositioned. Derek gave the crowd a small, theatrical bow. He was in control of the room, had been in control of the room for the past 40 minutes, and he carried that control with the ease of someone who could not imagine losing it. He moved to the center of the mat and took his stance, something close to a modified MMA guard. Hands high, weight slightly forward, the posture of someone expecting to dominate the center. Monica looked at him from the edge of the mat. She removed her watch, a plain worn thing, no brand visible, and set it on the corner of the mat. She pulled the elastic from her hair, retied it, and pulled the elastic again. The movements were not deliberate theater. They were the movements of a woman who was becoming incrementally less civilian. She took a breath and walked to the center. The referee, a local instructor who did not know what he was about to oversee, raised a hand. Derek bounced lightly on his toes. He had already decided how this would go. A quick takedown, controlled, let her up immediately, magnanimous in victory, clip it for the highlight reel. He was thinking about the edit. He was thinking about the caption. He was thinking about 3 things that had nothing to do with the woman standing 6 feet in front of him. Monica was not thinking about anything except the space between them. The referee dropped his hand. Derek moved forward with the confidence of a man who had done this hundreds of times because he had. His entry was clean as step with the right foot, a slight drop of the level, the beginning of a double-leg takedown that he had landed on opponents much larger and more experienced than the woman in the navy hoodie. His hands shot forward, his weight transferred. It was a good entry, It would have worked on almost anyone in that room. Monica moved left, not backward left, and fractionally forward, a shift of perhaps 15 centimeters that placed her body not where it had been and not where he expected it to be, but in the exact location where his momentum was creating a gap. Her right hand found his wrist. Not grabbed, found. The way water finds the lowest point of a container. She did not pull. She simply maintained contact while redirecting. A distinction that sounds minor and is not minor at all. His right arm extended past its optimal position. She turned her hip. His wrist rotated with her. He lost his base. This happened not because she forced him to lose it, but because the position his body was now in made it structurally inevitable, the way a building loses its base when a specific supporting beam is removed. He tried to recover with his left foot, and Monica had already placed her right foot in the location where his left foot needed to go. It was a small thing. It was an exceptionally precise small thing. His center of mass continued forward without his support structure, which is a clinical way of saying that he began to fall. She moved with him on the way down, which was the part that made the whole sequence unlike anything the professional fighters at the edge of the mat had seen outside of very specific training contexts. Most people, when they have created a takedown, stop creating it and let gravity finish the work. Monica did not stop. She was already 2 movements ahead, already placing her weight and her leverage in the configuration that would convert the fall into a controlled, locked position at ground level. When Derek hit the mat, he hit it on her terms, face down, right arm extended and locked at the elbow, her weight distributed across his upper back in a way that made it impossible to push up, roll, or in any meaningful sense, make a decision. His air moved incorrectly in his chest. His right wrist sent him a message that it was approaching a threshold it did not want to cross. He could not move. The referee, who had been watching, stood completely still for a moment that was probably 3 seconds long and felt considerably longer. Then, he moved forward. Monica had already released the pressure. Not completely, she maintained contact, maintained the structure, but she had taken the lockdown from the edge of serious injury to the threshold of controlled restraint. She was waiting for the official signal, not because she needed it, but because she understood the difference between demonstrating capability and causing unnecessary harm, and that difference was something she had thought about more carefully than most people in that room would ever be required to think about anything. The referee's hand came down. Monica stood up. The room did not react immediately. This is the part that is difficult to describe accurately. The way silence can be textured, can have a quality to it that is different from ordinary quiet. The phones were still recording. The live stream comment section was still visible on the screen behind the mat, but no one was making noise. The crowd of 300 people was simply there, present in a way they had not quite been present before, each of them processing the same information at slightly different speeds and arriving at the same place. What they had just watched was not what they had expected to watch, and the gap between those two things was large enough to be disorienting. Derek lay on the mat for a moment. Then he pushed himself to his knees, then to a standing position. He moved carefully, testing his right wrist with small rotations. His face had the careful blankness of a man who was working very hard to not let his face say what his face very much wanted to say. He looked at Monica. Monica was looking at no particular point in the room, standing with her arms at her sides, weight even, breathing normally. "What was that?" someone near the front said, quietly, not to anyone in particular. One of the professional fighters who had been watching from the barrier, a man named Greg, who had competed at regional level for 6 years and knew the difference between technique and exceptional technique, turned to the barrier-stained person next to him and said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "That wasn't sport. That was something else." The man next to him had competed internationally and had a very good understanding of what various disciplines looked like in live application. He nodded slowly. "That's military," he said. "Not martial arts. Military." Raymond Holt had made it to the edge of the mat. He stood there, looking at Monica, and he felt something that was close to relief, but was not quite relief. It was the feeling of a fact you already knew being confirmed in front of you. He had never doubted what she was capable of. He had simply been concerned about what might happen to whoever found out. He caught her eye for a moment. She looked at him without surprise. She had noticed him earlier, across the room, had identified him the way she identified everything in a room she entered, quietly and completely. She gave him the smallest acknowledgement, a shift of the chin, nothing more. Derek cleared his throat. He was trying to locate the version of this situation that he could manage the frame that would let him keep what he had built intact. "You used an illegal joint technique," he said. His voice was flat. He was managing it carefully. Monica turned to look at him. She had the expression of someone who has heard something predictable. "There are no illegal techniques outside a gym," she said. "Outside a gym, there is only what works and what doesn't." She said it without heat, without satisfaction, without anything that could be called cruelty. She said it the way someone states something they have known for a very long time. The crowd's relationship to Derek Calloway was shifting in real time, and he could feel it, the way a performer feels the room change beneath them. The live stream that had been carrying the usual cheering commentary, the giddy predictions of failure, the jokes at Monica's expense, had gone to something else. The comments that were arriving now were different in tone. Someone had already posted a side-by-side of the last 4 seconds of the engagement, slowed down, and the analysis was immediate and unsparing. People who understood what they were looking at were explaining it to people who didn't, and the explanation kept arriving at the same conclusion. The man with the black belt had not made a mistake. He had been handled precisely, efficiently, and with a degree of control that had prevented any serious injury, which, several people were already pointing out, was itself a kind of statement. The MC approached Monica with the microphone the way you approach something that you are not entirely sure is safe. "Can I ask, where did you train?" It was the wrong question, or at least not the right question, but it was the question he had, and he offered it. Monica considered it for a moment. "I spent 15 years in the military," she said. "The last 11 years of that were training close-quarters combat for special operations units." She paused. She was not delivering this as a revelation. She was answering a question. "I held the position of primary hand-to-hand combat instructor for SEAL team development programs." Another pause. "I'm retired now." The silence that followed was different from the silence after the fight. That silence had been the silence of surprise. This silence was the silence of recalibration, of people understanding that they had not simply witnessed something unexpected, but that the unexpectedness went back much further than the last 7 seconds, went back to the moment they had decided, at the first sight of a woman in a navy hoodie, exactly who she was and what she was capable of. Someone near the back of the room opened a browser on their phone and typed in a name. Then someone else did. Then several more people. The images that appeared: training facility photographs, a formal military portrait, a document from a special operations program that had been partially declassified, traveled from phone to phone, with the speed that information travels when a room full of people is simultaneously trying to catch up to a reality they had missed entirely. A younger man near the barrier, a trainer, clearly, someone who understood the discipline from the inside, raised his phone and looked at Monica with something that was not quite awe and was not quite embarrassment, but was somewhere in the complicated territory between them. "The ghost instructor," he said quietly. He did not say it loudly enough to be performing. He said it the way you say something when you are speaking to the fact of a thing rather than to the people around you. Monica heard him. She did not respond. Derek had moved to the edge of the mat. He had recovered enough to stand easily, to make his posture say things his face was still struggling with. He approached Monica the way you approach something that has rearranged your understanding of a situation. "Why didn't you put me down harder?" he asked. The question was quiet. It was, in its way, sincere. The first, genuinely sincere thing he had said all evening. Monica looked at him. "Because it wasn't necessary," she said. She was not being generous with this answer. She was being accurate. The distinction mattered to her, even if the people around them could not quite see it. "The point of what I was trained to do is to stop the problem," she said. "Not to be the problem." Derek stood with that for a moment. Whatever he had built, the brand, the numbers, the identity that had been assembled brick by brick in the years since he left the service, was not exactly rubble. It was still there. But it was different now, in the way that things are different once you understand their actual dimensions. He had been operating in a space he had decided he owned, and it turned out the space was larger than he knew, and other people had been in it before him. And some of those people had earned their place there in ways that made his own earning look like what it was. Real, but partial. He knew it. The crowd knew it. The camera was still running, and the footage would matter, because footage always matters now. But what it would show was not what he had intended it to show when he had looked across the room at a woman in a navy hoodie and decided she would be good content. A young woman made her way through the crowd toward Monica. She was perhaps 19, wearing the athletic clothes of someone who had been training, with the posture of someone who was still learning what to do with the capability she was building. She stopped in front of Monica and held out a small notebook, the kind fighters sometimes carry for notes. "Could you sign this?" she asked. Her voice had the quality of someone trying to be braver than they currently feel. "I've been training for 3 years. People keep telling me I'm too small, that I'll never be able to compete with men in a real situation." She stopped. She was trying to decide if what she wanted to say next was something she was allowed to say. "They've been saying that to me my whole life, that I'm not enough." Monica looked at her for a long moment. She took the notebook. She signed her name. Then she looked back at the young woman and said, with the directness of someone who does not deal in comfortable approximations, "Stop trying to be frightening." The young woman blinked. Monica continued, "Frightening is about them. What you want is to be someone they cannot dismiss. That's about you. Those are different things, and one of them is in your control." She handed the notebook back. The young woman took it with both hands. "The way you take something you intend to keep for a long time." The crowd had changed by this point in the way crowds change when a room has collectively understood that it misjudged something important. The people who had laughed at the beginning, not all of them, but most of them were experiencing the particular discomfort of a recognition that arrives too late to prevent itself. Some of them were standing differently. Some of them had put their phones away. Near the barrier, 3 fighters who had been training for years were watching Monica with the specific attention of people who understood, now, that they had been in the presence of something worth understanding and were trying to hold on to the memory of what it had looked like so they could learn from it later. Raymond Holt stood near the column where he had started the evening and watched Monica move toward the edge of the mat, and he felt, very clearly, the feeling of a story going the way it should go, which is not the same as a story going easily, and is not the same as justice, but is something a kind of coherence, a rightness in the sequence of events, the feeling that what happened for a reason that was in the nature of the thing itself. Monica picked up her watch from the corner of the mat. She turned it over once in her hand, checking the face, then secured it back on her wrist. She pulled her hoodie back on the faded navy one, the one that said nothing about her, the one that asked no one to look. She collected her jacket from the chair where she had set it at the beginning of the evening. The room was still watching her, but she was no longer particularly aware of it. Or if she was aware of it, she was indifferent in the way that someone is indifferent, when attention from the outside is a thing they have long since stopped needing. She was walking toward the exit when a journalist, a young man with a press credential and the slightly breathless energy of someone who had just realized that the story in the room was not the story he had arrived to cover, stepped into her path. He had his phone recording, though he had the awareness to hold it at his side, not thrust it toward her face. "Miss Grant, do you have anything to say? For people who think women aren't capable of this kind of thing?" Monica slowed but did not stop. She considered the question with the same unhurried seriousness she brought to everything. Then she said, "The most dangerous person in any room is usually the one who doesn't need to announce it." She walked past him. The doors opened and then closed, and she was in the corridor outside, and the sound from the hall dropped to a murmur, and then she was through the next set of doors, and the night air of Las Vegas pressed against her warm, smelling of car exhaust and concrete, and the distant suggestion of food from somewhere down the block. The parking structure was 300 meters to the left. She turned left. Her footsteps were quiet on the pavement. There were no lights tracking her, no camera crew, no crowd. There was just the city, doing what cities do at night, which is continue moving regardless of what has happened inside any of the buildings that contain it. She had a rental car on the second level. She had a flight at 6 in the morning. She had a conversation to have tomorrow afternoon with a former colleague about the young athlete she had evaluated, and she had a preliminary set of notes in her phone about what she had observed, and she had a small, specific hunger for the kind of food that tastes better after you have been in a room full of people for too long. These were the things she was thinking about as she crossed the parking structure. Not the fight, not the man on the mat, not the crowd, or the cameras, or the young woman with the notebook, who would carry that signature somewhere and unfold it at a moment when she needed it. Those things had happened and were complete, and Monica Grant had a long-established practice of not carrying completed things forward any further than she had to. The footage from the evening was already moving through the world at the speed that footage moves now, duplicated, captioned, analyzed, shared across platforms and message boards and training group chats and sports commentary feeds, breaking into spaces that had nothing to do with Las Vegas or martial arts showcases. Finding people in apartments and gyms and waiting rooms who watched it once and then again and then a third time, slowing it down, pointing at moments, arguing about the name for what they were seeing, arriving eventually at the same conclusion by different routes, that they had watched someone do something that most of what they knew about fighting had not prepared them to understand. Derek Calloway was not seen publicly for several weeks after that evening. When he returned, the content was different. It was harder to describe what the difference was, exactly, but it was there. The young woman with the notebook trained for 2 more years and eventually became an instructor. The words she had been given stayed with her, not as inspiration, but as a technical specification, a description of what she was trying to build, precise enough to be useful. Raymond Holt drove back to his hotel that night and sat at the small desk in his room for a long time without turning on the television. And he thought about Fort Bragg, and about evaluation teams, and about the particular shape of the world when someone who is exactly what they are stands in front of you and lets you see it. The analysts who dissected the footage frame by frame published their findings in 2 separate long-form posts that circulated through professional training communities for months. They agreed on most of the technical details. They agreed that what they had seen was unusual. They agreed that the word unusual was probably not adequate. Monica drove back to her hotel on a route she had memorized from the map she had looked at once that morning. She ate at a place near the hotel that was open late, a small diner with good eggs and coffee that arrived without her asking for it, the way good diners always do. She sat at the counter and looked at her phone for a while, and then put it away. She did not look up the footage. She had no particular interest in watching herself. She ate her food and drank her coffee, and paid her bill, and walked back to her room under a sky that had too many lights in it to show any stars. In the morning she would catch her flight. In the afternoon she would make her call. The world would continue doing what it had always done, which is move forward without waiting for anyone. And Monica Grant would continue moving through it the way she always had, quietly, precisely, and with a clear understanding of the difference between things that needed to be said and things that were better left to speak for themselves. There are people who learn to fight because they need to be seen. There are people who learn to fight because they love the performance of it, the theater, the crowd. And then there are people who learn to fight because at some point in their life they understood that the world contains real violence, and that real violence does not ask for your permission or your readiness or your credentials, and that the only honest answer to that understanding is to become as capable as possible and say as little about it as you have to. Monica Grant had been the second kind of person, briefly, when she was young. She had become the third kind a long time ago, and she had never once looked back. Some people trained to be noticed. Some people trained because the world required it of them, and they answered without complaint, and they kept answering long after the world forgot it had ever asked. She had learned this lesson not from a teacher, but from experience, which is the only school that teaches it properly. She had been 26 years old, the first time she was put in front of a group of men who did not believe she belonged there. And she had made the mistake of trying to explain herself, of leading with her record, her training history, the names of the instructors who had certified her. The men had listened politely and remained unconvinced, because credentials from people they had never heard of about a woman who did not fit the shape of what they expected did not constitute evidence to them. It constituted paperwork. She had understood, after that day, that the only argument that worked in certain rooms was a physical one, not because physical arguments were superior to verbal ones in any philosophical sense, but because in those rooms, in those particular rooms, physical reality was the only kind of reality that did not require their permission to be real. So she had stopped explaining. She had started simply being, and letting being be enough, and discovering over and over again that it was enough more than enough, and that the people who were most unsettled by that fact were always the ones who had expected her to need their validation and found that she had somehow managed without it. This was, she had come to understand, a specific kind of power. Not the power of domination or of superiority, but the power of sufficiency, the power of not needing. There were people in the world who built their sense of position on other people's deficits, and those people were deeply disoriented by someone who simply did not have the deficit they had expected. She had spent 15 years being that disorientation, and she had found a particular kind of peace in it that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with clarity. The military had been both the best and the most complicated thing that had ever happened to her. It had given her a discipline, a language, a set of skills that she could not have developed anywhere else in the same form. It had put her in the company of people who were serious, genuinely serious about capability, about preparation, about the difference between pretending to be ready and actually being ready, and that seriousness had been one of the sustaining facts of her career. She had loved the work. She had loved the precision of it, the honesty of it. There was a clarity to close quarters combat instruction that she found nowhere else, a directness that was almost a relief after the social complexity of everything else. When you are teaching someone to survive a genuine physical threat, the only question that matters is whether what you are teaching them works. Everything else is noise. But the noise had accumulated over 15 years in ways that the work itself could not compensate for. The question asked at the beginning of every new assignment. The peer who had submitted a report, attributing her program results to the male co-instructors. The evaluation board that had declined to advance her program without explanation. And the explanation that had arrived later, through channels, having to do with concerns about optics. She had faced each of these things without breaking, because she was not someone who broke, but she had faced them, and the facing had a cost, and eventually the cost had exceeded what the work could repay. She had submitted her retirement papers on a Tuesday morning in the same tone she had used to submit training reports for 15 years, carefully, accurately, without editorializing. She had not missed the institution. She had missed the serious people, occasionally. She had run into several of them since, and the encounters had the particular warmth of people who had shared something real and were glad to acknowledge it. Raymond Holt was one of those people. She had seen him across the room tonight and felt something that was close to fondness, which was a feeling she experienced infrequently enough that she noticed it when it arrived. He had been fair. He had seen what she was capable of, and treated it as a fact rather than an anomaly, which was, in her experience, relatively rare, and therefore worth remembering. The other thing she had not expected, when she left, was how quickly the world outside the military would replicate the same patterns she had spent 15 years navigating inside it. She had known, intellectually, that this would happen, that the dynamics that made certain rooms difficult were not specific to the institution, but were instead distributed throughout the culture, concentrated differently in different places but never entirely absent. She had known this. She had still been somewhat surprised by the consistency of it. By the way, a room in Las Vegas full of martial arts enthusiasts could arrange itself, within 30 seconds of her arrival, along exactly the same lines as a training facility briefing room in North Carolina 15 years earlier. The particulars were different. The underlying structure was identical. She had stopped being angry about it at some point, though she could not identify exactly when. Anger was an expensive emotion, and she was careful about expenses. What she had instead was a kind of steady, clear-eyed awareness, a recognition of the pattern that did not depend on being surprised by it or righteously indignant about it, but simply noted it, accounted for it in her planning, and moved accordingly. This was, she suspected, what some people called being hardened, though she did not think that was the right word for it. Hardening implied a loss of something. What she had was not a loss. It was an addition, an additional layer of information about how things worked, held alongside everything else she knew, used without drama or announcement. Derek Calloway had not been the worst version of the thing. She wanted to be accurate about that. He was not a violent man, not in the sense that mattered, not in the sense she had been trained to address. He was a man who had found a successful way to use other people's dignity as content, and who had not thought carefully enough about what that meant possibly because the rewards of not thinking carefully about it were substantial and immediate. He would think more carefully now, or he would not. She had done what the situation had asked of her, which was to answer a challenge honestly and without excess. She had declined to do more than the situation required. This was not mercy in the sentimental sense. It was economy, the same economy that governed everything she did on a mat, the same principle. Apply exactly what is needed, not less, not more. The diner was quiet at this hour. There was a cook visible through the pass-through window, moving with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had spent decades doing the same tasks and had arrived, through repetition, at a kind of mastery that looked like ease. Monica watched him for a while. She recognized that quality. It was what skill looked like when it had been integrated fully enough that it no longer required effort, not because the skill was easy, but because the person and the skill had become continuous, had stopped being separable things. She had a version of that relationship with her own training. She rarely thought about it consciously anymore. It was simply part of how she moved through space, how she assessed situations, how she stood in a room. It was the sediment of 15 years, settled below the surface, available without being visible. The coffee in her cup was still half full, and she drank it slowly, without hurrying, because there was nowhere she needed to be until 5 in the morning, when she would get up and take a shower and put on the same kind of clothes she always wore and drive the rental car back to the airport. The night was doing what nights do, moving toward morning without consulting anyone, without asking if everyone was ready. Monica Grant sat at the counter of the diner and let the night move. She was not thinking about the footage that was traveling through the world. She was not thinking about the young woman with the notebook, or about Raymond Holt driving back to his hotel, or about Derek Calloway sitting somewhere with an ice pack on his wrist, and a specific new understanding of certain things. She was thinking about eggs, and about whether the coffee was good enough for a second cup, and about the small, manageable facts of the next 12 hours, which was as far ahead as she had ever found it useful to look at any given time. She decided on the second cup. The cook poured it without being asked, glanced at her once, and went back to his work. She wrapped both hands around the mug. Outside the window, Las Vegas continued its particular performance lights and motion, and the accumulated noise of several 100,000 people living their lives at whatever volume they had chosen. Monica sat inside the quiet of her own company, which was a quiet she had learned to be comfortable in a long time ago, and which had served her reliably in the years since. She did not require an audience. She did not require acknowledgement. She required competence, coffee, and enough uninterrupted space to think clearly about whatever came next. These requirements had proven, over the course of a long and serious life, to be entirely sufficient. The most dangerous person in any room is usually the one who already knows exactly what they are and has long since stopped needing anyone else to confirm it. She finished the coffee. She set the mug down. She left a tip on the counter, a little more than the bill, and walked out into the warm Las Vegas night without looking back at the room.